Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery Channel. This is a channel where I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friends Stilgar and Great Pharaoh take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and usually hasn't heard about. Today, however, it is just me and Stilgar. So I'm going to ask Stilgar, what do you know about the medieval period? Probably a lot, but what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the term medieval?
The first thing that comes to mind, probably underappreciated.
Yeah.
I think they were actually much more advanced than people think they were during the medieval times, because it's all often portrayed as some kind of dark age, which it wasn't. But I guess maybe what defines it most to me is feudalism.
Yeah.
Is that something? But what are you looking for specifically?
No, that's fine. That's perfect.
Okay.
So the reason I decided to do this is because my older son, he asked me why the medieval period is called medieval. And he said, was it an evil time? Why they call it evil, basically? And so the answer to that is kind of complex. First of all, it's not evil as in EVIL. Medieval is spelled MEDIEVAL, and it actually comes from a Latin term, medium Aevum, which also means middle age. And so, in the English-speaking world, of course, we use medieval and Middle Ages interchangeably. They both mean the same thing. A lot of people are under the notion that medieval means evil, as in EVIL. And they don't know how it's spelled, and a lot of times people will commonly misspell it with evil in there. However, the term was actually created with somewhat nefarious purposes, or rather hostile purposes towards the time period, where people viewed it as, scholars who came later, they viewed it as a dark time and as a transitionary period, or a period of barbarism between civilizational progress. So the idea of the Middle Ages being a middle period actually starts in the Renaissance. And it's based on the notion that history can be divided up into three periods, or at least European history. And those periods are the ancient or classical, and the medieval, and then the modern. And the modern is considered to start with the Renaissance period. And it's predicated on the notion that, in the ancient world, civilization was progressing, but then it collapsed into a period of barbarism. And after we recovered from the barbarism, we started progressing again with the Renaissance period, and that's considered, the early modern period. It is a biased term, and you can kind of apply it to Europe, but it doesn't really, particularly Western Europe, but it doesn't really encompass the entire world. It's not a valid way of viewing the entire world. So the concept of there being a middle age of barbarism actually begins in the 1300s with an Italian humanist named Petrarch. And humanists are the ones that pushed this notion mainly. And what Petrarch said was, "For who can doubt that Rome would rise again instantly if she began to know herself?" Meaning, like, if we could return to our glorious past, then we might become a great empire again. The idea was further pushed by other Italian humanists with biased intent. And one of the reasons they were dismissive of the Middle Ages, or had a negative view of it and thought it was backwards, was because they thought that people were too religious during that time period. Of course, that's not the only reason, but that's a big one. And then it comes into common parlance with revived interest in classical art and civilization. During the 1800s, the term medieval starts to appear in English-speaking countries, and comes into use there. I looked up, I took the liberty of, because if you've noticed, people will use medieval as a adjective to frame something negatively, like to imply that something is barbaric or backwards. So I just looked up medieval in Merriam-Webster's online, and it gives a few definitions here. It says, 1, of, relating to, or characteristic of the Middle Ages. 2, having a quality such as cruelty associated with the Middle Ages. 3, extremely outmoded or antiquated. So what I want to do now is, even though, like, I agree with you that it's not fair to just dismiss this period as a backwards and barbaric time. Like, for example, the Roman army at its highest power is still not going to be as advanced as like the French military when Joan of Arc was there. Even though at that time France was a small, kind of weak country, there's still technological progress that goes on. But what I want to do is talk about some of the reasons, touch on them for why people consider this to be a dark time. So
can I just make 2 notes?
Yeah.
And maybe you'll address them later.
Okay.
But like you mentioned that people thought that they were too religious, and I was wondering, compared to what, antiquity, or because people were pretty religious during the Roman times as well.
Yeah.
So I would disagree there. And then cruelty, like like which you mentioned from the dictionary. Like, I would say that the Romans were pretty cruel. The Assyrians were pretty cruel. And I would say that a lot of the people, for example, in so-called enlightened days, when there were witch hunts and and other activities, were pretty cruel as well. So anyway, just a couple of notes from my side, but I'll let you continue.
Right. And that's very valid, right? So like I said before, I think it's an oversimplification to view the medieval period as to characterize it as being backwards or excessively violent. Because anytime you're going to say backwards or violent, what automatically must follow is compared with what. So
Exactly.
like these guys were living in a time when the influence of religion, the Catholic Church, was kind of waning a bit. And they were, at least in Italy, and they were able to do things, like they were able to get into the ancient literature. They were able to start conducting their own scientific developments. And, humanists are people that are basically trying to have something like Christian biblical morality, but without God, So they view religion as a negative thing, even though they copycat some of the biblical morals, like the idea of the non-aggression principle is really, is what Jesus said, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. So, but there is one way that I would consider the medieval period a bad time in general, and that is the perspective of from Europe. It was a time when Europe was not, like, European civilization as a whole was basically getting we were getting our faces kicked in. Like, it was not a time when any European country was like a major power. I mean, major, I guess, compared with one another, but there was no European colonialism, and we were being eaten up by, from a few different directions. So it was a time when Europe as a whole was on the receiving end of various difficulties and weaknesses. But at any rate, let me go through my examples here. And actually, each of these examples, they could actually be a topic of their own. So I'm going to try not to sit on them too long, but let's see. So first of all, what is the medieval period? Like, there is a range of time that we consider medieval. So typically it's thought to begin in the year 410 AD, when Rome is sacked, by Alaric the Visigoth. And a few people will say it starts in 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor, a guy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. And I would say, like, for me, 410 is the better date, because the sack of Rome was very shocking to the Western, to Europeans as a whole, or in general, I should say. And it was something that was thought to be, would never happen, kind of like the Titanic sinking. Although in my view, the Titanic sinking was much more obvious kind of thing that should have been anticipated. But at any rate, so that's what I would say. And then as far as when it ends, different dates and events are proposed as the end of the Middle Ages. So one is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which starts in 1517 and goes from 1517 to 1648. And the Protestant Reformation is very significant culturally, because it's what really severely weakens the power of the Catholic Church. And they have to change, they end up changing their practices as a result of it, even though they don't accept like the the recommendations from Martin Luther. They still do make some changes. And also another date that's proposed is the voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1493, when he sails to discover the New World. And that's significant because, actually, I think that's 1492. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I'll put something in the slideshow. But that's significant because it begins the age of exploration and colonization for European powers. And we are no longer just confined to Europe and being eaten up by other groups, but like Spain, Portugal, and then eventually England and even Netherlands, they start opening up colonies all over the world. So it begins with that. And then also another event that's suggested is the sack of Constantinople in 1453. And there's others besides that. But what I'm going to do for the purposes of this video, I'm going to say 1410 to 1517. So first of all, what changes when the Middle Age begins, and why does it begin? So during the Roman period, you have a term Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. And the reason that this is important is because the Roman Empire covered a huge area, ruled most of Europe, and also North Africa and parts of the Middle East. And prior to that, you had things like city-states, and you had to worry about things like the neighboring town, like the next town over, attacking you and taking your women and your cattle, stuff like that. Also highwaymen. So when the Roman Empire was there, they provided people with good roads, which facilitates trade and movement, libraries, running water, public bathhouses, social mobility. There weren't just like 2 or 3 social castes. There was middle class and different occupations you could do. There was realistic art and sculpture. To my knowledge, the Romans were the only people group for thousands of years, and also the first, well, I shouldn't say the first would be the Greeks, to engage in realistic sculpture, where the goal is to accurately depict the human form. Most other cultures had stylized forms of art that were not realistic. That's not to say they weren't good, but it's just the truth. So then also the Romans had concrete, which lasted for thousands of years, which we still don't quite know how it's made to this day. It's stronger than the current concrete that will be like in the sidewalk in front of your house.
Really?
And oh yeah.
Okay.
That's why so many of their buildings and roads are still around. That concrete lasted for thousands of years. What I heard is that it was mixed with some type of volcanic compound, and that's what gave it the strength. But yeah, nobody's quite sure how it was made. And of course, concrete undergoes a chemical change when it solidifies, so it's hard to know. But at any rate, also the idea of there being a pan-European identity starts with the Roman Empire. At least to my knowledge, it does. And one thing that Europeans have done since then is kind of try to bring this back in various forms. So Of course, I'm not going to go into the details about why the Western Roman Empire collapsed, because it's actually kind of debatable and it would take too long. But long story short, in the 370s AD, the Huns invade Europe, and they start pushing all these Germanic tribes to the south and west, right into Roman territory in many cases. And at this time, the empire is already split into two administrative units, the Western and the Eastern. The Eastern has its capital in Constantinople. The Western has its capital in Rome. But, in the late stages, it's actually moved to Ravenna. And then, of course, in 410, Alaric the Visigoth sacks Rome, and he engages in 3 days of looting and pillaging. And then in 455 AD, Rome is attacked by Vandals, who violently pillage it for 2 weeks. And this is where our term vandalism comes from, because their destruction was so severe that it came to be made into an adjective to describe destroying, I guess that'd be a verb to describe destroying property. And then in 476,
would be funny if there was still like a Vandal nation around today.
yeah,
it would be politically incorrect to talk about vandalism. So anyway.
Well, that would only be the case if they're, if they're Europeans, you can say anything.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So, if it's some other group, you can't. That would be hate speech probably. But so in, let's see, 476, Odoacer deposes the last Roman emperor, the guy named Romulus Augustulus, who I believe was actually a kid at the time. It's kind of just a puppet. And then in 493, Odoacer is killed by Theodoric, who converts Italy into an Ostrogoth kingdom. So basically, it's just wave after wave of trauma, and these Germanic tribes moving around, and regular people can't really do much about it. And we also did another video, like after the Ostrogoths, we have like a Byzantine attempt to retake Italy, and then eventually it falls to Alboin, the Lombard, which we have a video about him. That was the guy that drank. He married that woman, and then tried to
drink from her father's skull.
Yeah, Rosamunda, a drink from the skull of Cunimundus. Have a merry drink with your father.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's
like almost something out of like a sci-fi movie or something. Like a Klingon would do it or something. Yeah. Anyway,
a Klingon wouldn't do that because it would be dishonorable.
Oh yeah, okay.
But they would they might drink the blood of their enemies, maybe, or they had Klingon blood wine. I don't know what it's the blood
like,
of.
How do you come up with that though? Like, anyway, yeah, have a drink with your father.
The Klingon culture, as of like from Next Generation onward, is kind of heavily inspired by Germanic, by the Germanic barbarians, but also they've got like a sense of honor and stuff, which is more reminiscent of like the Japanese culture. So it's kind of like to some extent, it's like a hybrid of Japan and
Germany. So it's basically
Vikings.
the Axis.
The Axis, yeah. Yeah, you could say like that, I guess. But I actually don't think that Nazi Germany was as barbaric as their ancestors that came down, because like those guys had I guess they had some rules, but like, the Nazis, I mean, I don't support them or anything, just to be clear, but they did run a very clean ship, so to speak. Like they were very clean. They built infrastructure, monuments, all that kind of stuff. Whereas their ancestors smashed all that kind of stuff. So
they also had art, and they made jewelry and things like that. So
right. Well, after they started settling in and becoming a ruling class, they started building, and everything. And eventually, in some places like France, they assimilated and became indistinguishable from the native people. But yeah. Okay. Yeah, let's keep going. I don't want to dwell there too long. So another thing that happened as a result of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire is that there's no more realistic artwork being made. Like most of the medieval art is not realistic, especially during the period of the early Middle Ages. You have stuff that looks like it was drawn by a kid, a middle schooler, like the Bayeux tapestry or Bayeux tapestry, which commemorates the Norman conquest of England, is a prime example of this. Even though it was meant to be this glorious commemoration, it looks like something that I would have drawn when I was 12. You know, it's the kind of art that you'd see in like sixth graders and seventh graders. And to be fair, however, I have to say that during the late Roman Empire, the quality of the artwork was already kind of taking a dip anyways. But this was like the nail in the coffin. And even up into the high Middle Ages, when artwork got more detailed, and they did attempt to try to make attention to detail and have things like things fading into the distance and attempt to do perspective and complex outfits and light sources. They're still making mistakes like putting the thumb on the same side of both hands, and the perspective is not really it's not really being done properly. Relative sizes of things, all sorts of issues. So one way the Italian humanists are right, it does take Europe a long time to recover artistically from this collapse. So another thing that happens is
they were building beautiful churches.
I know. Yeah, I know. Yeah, you're kind of jumping. That's okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right
Okay.
about that. They did do that. There's a Gothic architecture comes later on in the Middle Ages. So that's what I was going to say later on in the video is that there was a lot of great architecture and stained glass windows when it comes to church architecture during the Gothic period. Gothic period was original design that was not based off of Roman precedents, and you can still see some cultural influence, like in Catholic churches today from that, even in the United States. And you have something else that came later, like the Bauhaus movement, which started in Germany in the 1930s, was where they're like, we want to have architecture that doesn't have any roots in anything that came before, but it's ugly and hideous, and cubistic and doesn't look like anything. Gothic also didn't have roots in the Roman architecture, but it looks awesome. It was more like the Germanic influence, but I was going to get to that later. But
okay, I was going to say the Notre Dame was finished, I think, before the end of the medieval age, and there are many other churches.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right about that. But
and then if you look at some of the liturgical art that they have, like using gold and things of that matter, it's quite remarkable, I would say.
Yeah, the color scheme is nice, but the technique is not good. Like it's not. It does look like it's some. It would be like if you gave me in middle school gold paint to paint like the comic books that I was doing. That's the level of the. That's the level of the medieval art. Like I'm not trying to be like a
well, like they're also making
but,
jewelry and stuff, and like crosses and crucifixes and things like that.
yeah, they're 3D art. They're 3D art in the as you get towards the later Middle Ages. The 3D art is pretty good. The architecture is pretty good. The 2D art is not good until the Renaissance period.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I understand. That's fine. You're actually probably anticipating what some of the people in the comments will say. So
I'd hope so.
Probably saving us from. No,
I would
it's
say
fine.
that medieval art is superior to a lot of the modern day art. That's what I would say.
I agree with that. And actually, that's one of the things I want to talk about in the end after I go through all my.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'll let you go. Okay.
No, that's. Hey, man, if you want to say something, you can say it anytime.
Okay. All right.
Like that one, I will get back to it. So
yeah.
So coming to the dark aspects, though, like what made. So these are some of the reasons why people say that it's a tough period, and I agree with them to some point. Though I don't agree with it like as being a particularly evil time per se. But one thing is feudalism. So feudalism is a result of people needing stability and shelter. It also stems somewhat from Germanic Germanic fealty kind of stuff. So feudalism occurs mainly as a means to achieve safety because there's no longer an imperial army, so people are relying on local strongmen and lords for defense. And basically what happens is Europeans return to the oldest form of Indo-European social organization, which is to break the society down into three basic parts: those who fight, those who work, and those who pray. And the Indo-Aryans who brought Hinduism to India, they were originally divided up along those lines, where those who fight were called Kshatriyas, those who pray were the Brahmins, those who work were the Vaisyas. But what happened in India is that they took the native people and made them into a fourth caste called the Sudras. So they ended up dividing there ended up being two working castes. So the Vaisyas ended up just being like merchants, and the kind of upper class working roles, and then the Sudras were like more manual, menial labor kind of stuff. And then, but anyway, we're not gonna dwell on that too much here. But basically, that's what happened, is a reversion to that model. And under feudalism, social mobility is extremely limited. Land ownership is difficult, and it's off the table for the average European. Mainly, you're going to be working on somebody else's land, from cradle to grave. Well, you not work when you're a baby, but basically, there's no chance for you to really become middle class, and certainly not upper class. And feudalism lasts roughly from the 5th century to the 12th centuries. So in the late Middle Ages, it starts to break up anyways. People start to achieve social mobility. Another great difficulty of the medieval period was the Islamic invasions. So Muslims invaded Spain in 711 AD, led by a guy named Tariq ibn Ziyad. And Tariq ibn Ziyad was Berber or Amazigh. And based on the pictures of him, he actually looked kind of like you. He had like blonde hair and blue eyes. And he was by 714, most of the Iberian Peninsula is ruled by Muslims. This guy did most of the work conquering it. And then he was recalled by the Caliph, I believe. And then during the Islamic period in Spain, the social order was like this. Arabs were the ruling class with the highest status, even though the guy that actually conquered the land was not an Arab. And after the Arabs, you have the Amazighs, Berbers, who made up most of the army and did most of the conquest. They were the main guys. Following them, native Europeans who had converted to Islam. And then the next rung down is Christians and Jews, who are the lowest status, or the second lowest status, I should say. And the people that are beneath them are slaves. And the slaves are going to be, and they're mostly captured from Northern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. I actually found a picture of this, I'll include it. Muslims continue to expand north of the Pyrenees until 732, when they're defeated by Charles Martel. But it's going to take a long time for Europeans to drive them out. It won't be done completely until after the marriage of Fernando and Isabel, which that might make another good topic some point in time. So that actually ends up being done close to when Christopher Columbus is sponsored. Like Fernando and Isabel, they drive out the remaining Muslims. They also sponsor Christopher Columbus on his voyage. The next great misfortune is the Black Death, which lasts from 1346 to 1353. And it's the most devastating plague in history, much more severe than any so-called modern pandemics. And
did they use 2 weeks to flatten the curve, or?
They did some crazy stuff. Like there were people. They actually did. Well, I heard they actually locked people into their houses and nailed them shut because they.
Well, the mortality rate was what? what, like 60 or 70% or something?
So it's hard to, there aren't really any exact figures. At least 25 million people died from the plague, but I've seen other figures that were like much higher, like 70 million. And it's estimated that either like anywhere from 1/8 to 1/3 of the European population was killed by it. And there's lots of depictions of this in medieval art. You can see images of like skeletons and things that look like zombies dancing around, you know, and there's also there's this song, kind of song, you know, that was still being used a little bit when I was a kid, though I think my generation's probably the last one. It's called "Ring Around the," you know, "Ring Around the Rosie, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down."
Ah, no, my kids sing that as well. I didn't know that's what that came from. Okay.
Yeah, when you all
Yeah.
fall down, it's because you died from the plague. That's what it means.
Oh.
Yeah, so like "Ring Around the Rosie," there's the red marks that appear on the skin during the early stages. Pocket full of posy. During the medieval period, they thought that disease was spread by smell. If you smell a bad thing, you could become sick.
Yeah.
It's airborne. So they would use like flowers and things and perfumes to kind of mute the smell. And actually, when you see like there's these images of these guys wearing like these coats and these helmets that look like bird heads of these medieval doctors, like that beak that's on their face, it's not to make them look like a bird. Like that beak is full of some kind of perfume or like potpourri kind of thing. And the idea was the doctor would be smelling that, and it will protect the good smell will kill the bad fumes of the disease. It's to protect them so they can examine the patients. And actually, you still kind of see that costume in RPG games and stuff. Like ESO
Yeah, you see
has
it in carnival traditions over here as well in Europe still.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So we still
And
have
the smells might have worked because, well, not for the doctors, but if you put the pockets full of posy, because it was carried by fleas, I think insects hate certain herbs and smells, so may have had some limited effect. Well, not after you've been infected already, but
yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah, talk about zombie apocalypse, man. The plague is like, that's like some zombie apocalypse kind of happening. So yeah.
the closest thing, yeah, I think zombie apocalypses are inspired by, by pandemics and the fear of that, but also like we talked about in my other video about Samhain or Samhain, that a lot of this stuff stems from Irish tradition. You know, like America is heavily influenced by the Irish culture, to the point where you could almost make a case for America also being a colony of Ireland to some extent. Not a perfect case, but you could like trump something up. But also the I think that's where our zombie culture comes from. The idea of the dead returning, and also though there's something in Germanic tradition about Draugr, which are like zombies that live in the tombs.
Yeah, it's a Nordic tradition. Yeah, the evil dead that come back to life.
Once something gets to America, it just becomes commercialized and mass produced, and then people in other countries start buying it for whatever reason.
Yeah, but I mean the plague is imagine, like, because I do know that in some towns it was like half the population that died, and then if you lose so many people, then your whole society starts to fall apart. If we lost like 20% of the population only, or quote unquote only, our whole society would fall apart because it would be people operating computers that are vital, that are operating plants that are vital, medication production, like everything would fall apart basically. So
yeah, I agree. And it's interesting, how our ruling class today keeps talking about they want to reduce the population. There's too many people in the world, but I don't think they can do that and still enjoy the kind of standard of living they have now because the infrastructure would not be here. But yeah, also getting back to the Black Plague, there's another tradition that started or at least flourished during that time. People called the flagellants. And these guys would like take their shirts off and they'd go around whipping themselves in a procession. And the reason they would do it is because they thought the plague was the wrath of God, like he was angry at them and therefore sending this plague. And so they figured, well, let's punish ourselves very openly and painfully so that God will accept that we've been punished enough and maybe withdraw the plague. And I believe that this happened mainly in like Germanic countries, mainly in Germany. Which
you also see that, I think, within the Shiite religion as well. They still do that today, where they and I think you also see it in Tibetan culture. This kind of I don't know if they do self-flagellation, but hurting yourself in order to atone for your sins.
So the Shiite ritual that I know of is where they cut themselves on the forehead, and that is not to atone for sins, it's to mourn like the murder of Ali or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they do that in Iran and Afghanistan, I think, as well. I've seen that. Yeah, that's for Islam is like a works-based religion anyways, so
no, it's not like uncommon to think that you're being punished by God if something that bad happens. I think a lot of people would feel that way today if something like that happened.
I would feel that way for sure.
Yeah.
Now I kind of feel like America's being punished by God right now, but yeah. So,
okay.
But moving right along.
Okay.
The next thing is the Mongol invasion. Well, actually, it's not the next thing. This actually happens before the plague. I went out of orders, but it's
the Vikings. You got the Vikings already, or
I didn't mention the Vikings. Actually, the Viking invasion is another thing, but I didn't quite finish my research on that.
Okay.
But yeah, the Viking invasion was another difficulty, and the thing that horrified Europeans about the Vikings is that they would target churches. And of course, the Vikings, they didn't find like the churches to be sacred or anything like that. They knew that there was a lot of wealth in there, so they went and they got it. And they would also sell women, European women. They'd collaborate with the Muslims and sell European women to the Muslims, and they'd launch like slaving raids and stuff. So, yeah, that was another thing. And the Vikings, they had something, I think it's called the Crimson Eagle, where they would crack you open, your torso, and they'd take your lungs out and put them on your back. Yeah.
Yeah, they would do it from the back, and they would break all your ribs open. And then pull out both of your lungs and make them like wings.
There was something I read when I was in middle school about the Vikings, and then it's actually in one of the books that I used as my source for this topic. But people were so scared. There was like a Latin phrase, like a prayer they would recite: "A furori normanorum libera nos Domini." So it means like, from the fury of the Northmen, liberate us, God, have mercy on us. Like, don't let them fall on us, because there's not going to be help if they do. Yeah, and actually, the Viking invasions are what led to a lot of very serious ethnic and political conflicts later, because you had like England, being ruled by Anglo-Saxons. And then they got attacked by the regular Vikings, like the pure original Vikings from the north. And then a little bit later, they got attacked by the Normans, which were Vikings who had colonized Western France and kind of assimilated and were now speaking French. And the English couldn't deal with both of them at the same time. So the Vikings, the Normans end up taking over. And for a while, the ruling class for England actually speaks French. And this is what caused the transition from the Old English, the Anglo-Saxon language, to Middle Period English, because the language was altered by the French element. Yeah, it changed the language, and then it also leads to the 100 Years' Wars and other things. But yeah, so yeah, there's that, and then the Mongol invasion was actually much more terrifying. But that it affects Eastern Europeans more severely. So the Mongol invasion lasts from 1237 to 1241. But after it's over, the Mongols still are going to rule there for a good long time, and they're going to create the Golden Horde. But during the invasions, things are pretty rough on Eastern Europeans. So the European conquests occurred under Ogedai Khan and involved the invasions of Russia, Hungary, Volga, Bulgaria, Poland, Dalmatia, and Wallachia. And cities that resisted were subjected to mass slaughter and physical destruction. Buildings got destroyed, as well as looting. So it's a severe damage, to the population, as well as history and culture. Cities that surrendered without a fight were subject to things like conscription. They would just take some of the men and be like, "You're going to fight with us now, whether you want to or not," and having their food supplies looted. The grain and the animals, whatever's there. The Vikings, the Mongols would feed themselves as they went also, from the people that they conquered. In 1237, the city of Ryazan is besieged by the Mongols, and it takes about, from December 16th to 21st. And there's an account that comes from the Voskresensk Chronicle, and I got this quote here. The Tatars took the town of Ryazan and burned it all, and killed its prince Yuri and his princes, and seized the men, women, and children, the monks, nuns, and priests. Some they struck down with swords, while others they shot with arrows and flung into the flames. Still others they seized and bound, cut and disemboweled their bodies. And then they also, regarding the mass slaughter in Ukraine, we have an account here from Giovanni de Piano Carpini, who was working for the Pope. He was a representative of the Pope that came in about 6 years after the Mongols had taken Ukraine. And he said the following here: when we were journeying through that land, we came across countless skulls and bones of dead men lying about on the ground. Kiev had been a very large and thickly populated town, but now it had been reduced to almost nothing.
Wow.
Yeah. And then
that's crazy, man. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they would mess you up. And they also did this in the Middle East as well. Like when they conquered Persia, they did that sort of stuff there as well.
Does anybody ever talk about reparations from the Mongols? Like, well, you can get your Mongolian money.
I don't know what you would get from them today. They lost everything in the long run.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Maybe they'll give you some of their grass-fed beef if you're lucky.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I'd rather have that than what we have, but
yeah, that sounds tasty. But I think they have yaks over there, don't they? I'm not sure if I would like yak.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, maybe.
I tried.
I don't know nearly as much about their culture as I'd like to know, so you might have to investigate them. For another topic. But basically mass slaughter. Also in Poland, in Krakow, Poland, when the Mongols came to attack that city, there was a guy that tried to sound the alarm. He's going to play some tune on his trumpet that I guess means invaders are coming, and the Mongols from the distance, they took him out with an arrow to the throat so that his song stopped before he could finish it. And they still, like on a certain day of the year, or this is what I heard, they still will have somebody go up on the wall and start playing the trumpet and then stop at the point where the guy got shot in the throat. And the Mongols, while they're invading Eastern Europe, they clash with a lot of different European forces. Heavily armored cavalry, foot soldiers, all the kinds of all sorts of units, and they always would kill them. It didn't matter how many units the Europeans had or of what kind. They still lost all these battles. What ultimately slowed them down in Eastern Europe was the fortified cities, some of the fortified cities in Hungary. That kind of slowed them down. And then finally what happened that is Ogedai Khan died. And so the Mongols stopped their conquest in order to deal with the succession issues that followed. But then they turned Russia into the Golden Horde, and it would be a while before the Russians took control again. And let's see here. The last thing I want to talk about is the Catholic Church. And they had the policies that they had for heresy, and this is like something that the humanists I think were upset by, but also Protestants. So the punishment for heresy was to be burned at the stake, and then the punishment for suspected heresy was confinement for the rest of your life. And so to be fair, when the Roman Empire fell, the Catholic Church was not the highest authority, the emperor was, and they were not responsible for their own protection. But when the empire fell, they had to do something, because there were severe, like Rome was getting sacked over and over again, and then you had things like Alboin that comes down and sacks it again, and they had to do something to achieve peace and stability. So they made efforts to get all of these Germanic kingdoms and chieftains and kings converted. And then some of them, like Charlemagne, would use force to spread the religion onto other Germanic tribes. But then the Catholic Church also did a lot of missionary efforts to get people voluntarily into the fold. And those missionary efforts also brought in a lot of pagan customs, like we talked about with Samhain, and then also the customs of Yule, which merged with Christmas. And their method was kind of to, rather than get people to stop what they're doing, to kind of relabel it and repurpose it, maybe clean it up a bit, because they were afraid to just, be a complete killjoy, completely kill people's fun. So they ended up getting some of this. Also, one of the ways that they maintain control and power, aside from nominating different kings, and crowning them, is very hard punishments. Like heresy is not, for them, it's not that you said something that goes against the Bible or that's wrong according to the Bible. If you say something that goes against the Catholic Church, that's what is heresy. So they have canon, which comes from papal decrees and other things like that. So you have to be careful what you say. If you say the wrong thing, you could be charged as a heretic. So I have an example of somebody that was punished for heresy, and also somebody punished for suspected heresy. Some two famous examples. So the famous example for heresy is Joan of Arc, who lived from 1412 to 1431. And in my view, this is one of the most egregious executions and trials as far as punishing people for heresy goes. So Joan of Arc, at the beginning of her military career, before she really started leading troops and all that, she's examined by French theologians affiliated with the Catholic Church, and they want to make sure that she's not a heretic, because she's claiming things like, I'm God's telling me to do this, and I'm receiving visions and all this stuff. So they want to make sure that she's not a heretic, because the penalty for heresy is very severe, and maybe you might also get punished by way of by guilt of association, basically. So what they find after thorough examination is that all of her beliefs and views are what is considered to be correct according to the Catholic Church at the time. So basically they found no fault in her. And then they also examined her to make sure that she was a woman, but they had, to make sure that she was a virgin, but they had women do that. So they had the women check to make sure that she was a virgin, and they found that she was. So Joan retook territory for Charles VII, who hadn't even been crowned king yet, because he had to be crowned at Reims. So she took Reims for him, and some other places as well. And he was crowned in 1429. However, after his coronation, he decides that rather than continuing to fight, he wants to make peace with the English and the Burgundies, whereas Joan wants to liberate the rest of France. So he enters into negotiations with them, and after a while, he makes an agreement with the Burgundians where he agrees to hand over some cities back to them that the French had actually reconquered. And the people in those cities didn't agree to it, and Joan doesn't agree to it. So she goes and she tries to take those cities back, or to keep them from falling into the hands of the Burgundies. And during this time, they actually capture her, and the king doesn't do anything to get her back. He just lets them have her. And then because she said that I'm sent by God and everything, the English, they have to try and prove that she's a bad person and a heretic. So they put her on trial, and they accuse her of heresy. And later on, will do a topic on Joan where I go into all the details of this. But the charges of heresy come down to basically character assassination, where they say that because you wear men's clothes and have short hair and are going into battle, that you're not a good person. She's some kind of evil person and pervert. And also they say that as a result, her voices can't be from God that she's hearing. They have to be from Satan. So she's a witch that communicates with the devil, and so on and so forth. And they hand her over to the English for execution, and she's burned at the stake, because that's the punishment for heresy. But they do it in such a way that it takes her longer to die. They deliberately make it take longer. Like, there's a raised platform, and they don't allow anyone to kill her while she's being burned. So it's a pretty awful death. And that's an example of people getting accused of heresy and burned at the stake. And it can be very subjective, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the example of someone getting punished for suspected heresy, of course, that's Galilei, which we talked about in the video on Ptolemaic cosmology, if anyone wants to go there and watch. I guess you could say he lived kind of after the medieval period. He lived from 1564 to 1642, but he's a pretty famous example. They charged him with suspected heresy because he went against the Ptolemaic cosmology. He wasn't really trying to start a fight with the Catholic Church or to say that the Bible was wrong or anything like that. But what happened is the Catholic Church had adopted the Ptolemaic cosmology, which was the view of the scientific establishment throughout the Roman period and most of the Middle Ages. Well, all of the Middle Ages, really.
There was a scientific consensus back then.
Yeah, it was exactly. So
that's how what happens when you have science being determined by the majority of scientists,
right?
And then you say that is science,
yeah.
Or otherwise you're a science denier, right? So
yeah, that's pretty much what it is. You'd be considered a science denier during the times of antiquity, like Greek and Roman period, if you went against this theory. And then what happened is the Catholic Church just canonized it because they figured, well, it's already scientifically proven, so we'll make it canon. And so if you questioned it, you were a heretic, even though it's an example of, you could go down for questioning something. It's not even something that's mentioned in the Bible one way or the other. But because the church had made it their official doctrine, now you're not allowed to question. But it didn't start with the Catholic Church or the Bible. It started with, the Greeks, the scientific establishment. And Claudius, I think like Aristotle, and then Claudius Ptolemy was the one who made it into a mathematical model. So yeah, and actually, this is one of the things like atheists, they'll a lot of times will say, that this is an example for why church and religion should stay out of science and not weigh into scientific matters, you know. But the fact of the matter is, like, it wasn't something that started with, it was something that started with the scientific establishment. And I think the real lesson of it is, you know, that you should not add things to scripture. You should just stick with what the Bible says. Because
Yeah,
the Catholic Church was put into the position of having to defend something that was indefensible, either from a scientific perspective or biblical perspective.
and irrelevant, by the way. And
Yeah.
plus, I would say that, you know, like something is canon is what you hear a lot now. I think the
Mm.
whole idea that something is canon when it comes to science, you know, is not the right way of conducting science. Science actually means questioning. So anyway, and
Right.
theorizing. So if you have a separate theory and you have some evidence to base it up or back it up, then that should be open. That shouldn't make you some kind of enemy of science or whatever. Yeah,
The enemy of the, yeah, and we're
of
in
the
that
consensus.
situation.
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
we're in that situation again. Like, you know, I've had people tell me, getting into arguments about different things, like, well, you're not a scientist, so you shouldn't have your own views. You should just say what they say. But like, these are the same people that say a woman can be trapped in a man's body, and I'm
yeah.
sorry, but that's
There's
absurd.
there's no
And
there's no science to back that up either.
that's right.
But yeah,
That's
but what I wanted just to say, by the way, about Joan of Arc, how she was, how to use these heretic laws to get rid of her. If you look at the witch hunts or the witch purges, those mostly happened during the modern early days, early modern period.
uh,
And they were also often used against the women that were poor, and you like had very little power. Although I guess Joan of Arc did have power or too much power, that was the problem. But not, it wasn't during medieval times. It was after, when people were supposedly much more enlightened and all of that.
yeah, the
So
Salem witch trial. I mean, that's another thing you can say is, like, these people were, you know, supposedly it was a Protestant, you know, it was a Protestant denomination. They're supposedly operating from um, the perspective of sola scriptura and
yeah, yeah, and
exegesis.
then they come
But
up with things like, I know that they also happened in the Scandinavian world, that they had this trial. If there wasn't enough evidence, they would just basically try it, throw the woman into the sea, and then see if she floated. And then if she didn't float, then she was innocent. And if she did float, then she would have to, you know, she was, of course, guilty and would have to be burned on the stake. Which, you know, like I think they were Lutherans mostly up in Scandinavia. And there's like, where's the biblical
Lutherans were in Germany.
justification for that? Like, what? So
Yeah,
yeah,
there's
yeah,
really no justifying. I mean, you're doing that kind of stuff, like Jesus said, didn't say to go and burn them at the stake, you know, and especially not based on hearsay. Like, he told people, you know, not to kill. And when Peter cut off that guy's ear, which probably he was trying to cut off his head, and the guy just dodged, and he got his ear. But like, Jesus picked it up and put it back on. So it's definitely, you know, a case of you taking, you know, you kind of doing something that you want to do and going outside of scripture. So yeah.
yeah. But it also goes beyond that, because I think it goes, it's about fear. And I would say that actually the time right after the Middle Ages is
Mhm.
much darker than the so-called Dark Ages, because you know, all those witch hunts and things like that, they happened because people were so scared of like dark Satanist powers out there, which, by the way, again, is also not biblical. Because if you are, you know, a Bible reading Christian, then you're not going to be scared about Satan like doing everything, or some woman looking at you wrong, and then like all your crop dies and stuff like that. But that was pretty mainstream during those times. I think those were really dark times. Also, literally
Superstition.
dark times, because they had something called the Little Ice Age happening, I think, or starting right after medieval times, which was a time of great famine and disease and people living in bondage, and just living miserable lives riddled with alcoholism and typhoid and all kinds of other diseases. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
I would probably much rather live in medieval Europe than in the Europe of like the 1500s. But
Yeah, I think if I might actually rather live in medieval Europe than live in what we're probably about to see here. I would probably just go to the Catholic Church and not say anything.
yeah, me
But
too.
yeah, I mean, and then, but another thing is like most people in medieval period, like the Catholic Church kept the Bible to themselves, like you weren't allowed to own one. So
Yeah.
that's another thing. But yeah, I think I would just probably, I would just keep my head down. I think what we're headed towards now is far more frightening. But so okay, so yeah, that was the last example. What I want to do now is like get to some of the modern connections. So yeah, what you said about the Gothic cathedrals is what I was going to say. There was some good architecture that occurred not during the it's important to know the difference between the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a longer period. The Dark Ages is what happened when it's like when the Roman Empire collapsed, the Western Roman Empire, and it was a dark time for a while with these Germanic tribes invading, and like Odoacer and Alboin and all them, Visigoths and Vandals, like just wave after wave of destruction, and a lot of knowledge got lost. But that's not the only Dark Age. There's lots of Dark Ages in different parts of the world throughout history. Like when the Dorians came down and invaded Greece, that's the Dark Age. The Bronze Age collapse elicited some Dark Age in the Middle East. Also, the Indo-Aryan invasion of the Indus Valley culture was a Dark Age. So there's not just one Dark Age. So it's wrong to use Dark Ages and Middle Ages interchangeably. However, the beginning of the Middle Ages was a Dark Age, but I can see some of the there was some good music that was written. I like to listen to medieval music, and all that. So I wouldn't say that it's like a particularly bad time except from the perspective that Europeans were very weak during that time. Like we were in a situation of being conquered rather than going out and exploring and conquering ourselves. Then there's some parallels that I kind of see history repeating itself to some extent, like we talked about the art. And even the Bayeux tapestry is better than anything that I've seen in the museums today. Like the thing is, like during the early Middle Ages, they lost the techniques to make realistic artwork. But what excuse do we have today? Like where all the knowledge and the techniques are there, but people are choosing to make degenerate art that doesn't look like anything. Like if you go to any art museum after the Romantic period, like from the 20th century onward, it's just a decline as far as the artwork goes of what you see in the museums. Like I had this experience once when I was a kid. My mom took me to a museum. I forget the name of it. It was in St. Louis, big museum. It was like art and antiquities, so they had mummies there too. And I was really enjoying it until we got to the modern art. The latest section was like all full of garbage stuff. But it was either as we were leaving or as we were just getting there. There was this big old steel beam. Like the coming into the museum, there's a big lobby where you would like check in, and there's this big old steel beam going along the ground. And I just went and started walking on the beam because I used to like to climb and walk on stuff when I was a kid. And the security guard says, "Hey, get off the art." And I just kept walking because I didn't conceive that he was like talking to me. I thought it was a construction, renovation or something like that. I was like 9 or 8 years old. And he says, "Get off the art again." I was like, "What?" And it turned out he was talking to me. So I got off. I'm like, "This is art?" He said, "Yes." And I got off. How was I supposed to know? It's a steel beam. That's not art. But so I see like a severe decline in art starting in the 20th century. And Pablo Picasso, and this is something I heard. I can't remember what my original source was, but supposedly his logic was, well, now that we have cameras, there's no reason for an artist to engage in realism. So our job is to do something else. But like what you're doing is garbage. I mean, there's like no nice way of putting it. It's something that my 3-year-old could do. So, the art is definitely taking a slump, and it reminds me of, like the Roman Empire in the late stages, the artwork started to take a slump. And of course, when the Dark Ages came, when they were overthrown, it took the whole medieval period to recover, basically up till the Renaissance started, before they were able to start making realistic, full scenery type paintings again. Even though they,
but they didn't lose everything when it came to architecture and buildings and stuff like that. So
they didn't lose the build. Yeah, the architectural stuff was kind of on hiatus for a while, but they didn't completely lose the techniques. But 2D art was devastated, and actually we owe a lot of the thanks to the Catholic Church for preserving the literature and the scientific knowledge from the ancient world. People like to attribute it to Muslims, but Muslims actually, they were big book burners. Like Great Pharaoh, he talks about that a lot, like how they burned all the books when they came into Egypt and such. But the Catholic Church, they tried to save everything. Of course, their problem was then that they tried to keep it all to themselves too.
Yeah, the vast majority of all the old texts, like the Greek texts and Roman texts, were preserved by the Byzantines, and but because they were cut off from the West for a long time, it took a while for those texts to come back. But yeah, they kept a lot to themselves for sure. So.
Yeah, and actually, one of the articles I read, they gave some logic for the sack of Constantinople being the end of the medieval period, because they said that as the Ottomans overran the Byzantines, a lot of the scholars and scientists they fled to Italy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I agree. And anyway, I was going to say something else, but yeah, definitely, I think that played a big role.
Yeah. No, I do think we're headed towards another cultural dark age, but it's not because of being ransacked. Another thing is mass immigration that's going on right now, like into Europe and into the United States. That's something that happened in the Western Roman Empire during the late stages, like in the 4th century a lot, and then culminating in the sack of Rome. People think they just came in as like walls and walls of troops, and they did do that as well. But also they just came in as families with women and children and livestock.
It's more gradual. People don't realize how time works because they can only usually think about the time span of one single life.
Right.
And but yeah, if you look at a couple centuries, then those demographics have a huge impact. So
it changed the culture and the politics of the Western Roman Empire, and also the army itself started to fill up with Germanic populations as well. And of course, that's a case of some of them were very loyal, but not all. And of course, that's a case of the fox guarding the chicken coop. Of course, they're going to eat the chicken. So, yeah, kind of see some repeating patterns, like.
Well, that's why history is so important. And that's, I think, part of the reason we started this series is because people don't know the past, and then they don't learn. and they don't know. Like by looking at some of these patterns throughout history, you can predict what's going to happen in the future. Of course, not exactly. There's always some kind of black swan, or you know, there could be another plague or something that we don't. But when it comes to stuff like demographics and power plays and doing all these wars that are proxy wars and how that might influence our future, um yeah, definitely there are things that we can learn and how that might influence our future for better or for worse. In many cases for worse. So well, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I've had this thought for a long time that one lifetime, one human lifetime, is not enough to understand the world. Like you really need to look at history in order to understand what all is happening today. And one thing I've that's frustrated me for a long time is how little the average person cares about history. And today you have that a lot of people think, oh, wisdom comes with age, and yeah, it does, but not all old people end up being wise. You really have to look at history, and you'll see some repeating patterns, and it's what will allow you to predict the future. Not perfectly, of course, but you can be like, well, hey, this is happening. If it keeps happening, we're going to end up going in this direction. And a lot of people have normalcy bias and like, oh no, that will never happen. I'm 40 years old. I've never heard of such a thing. Well, you'd hear of such a thing if you looked at things that happened before you were born.
Mm,
So,
right. Or even like some people even within their life, like because I know that my country has changed dramatically in
oh yeah.
in the past couple decades. So, but even then, people, they're just so blind to say, okay, well, let's extrapolate that and see what does the country look like 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. I think most people just don't give a shit, to be honest. Um,
As long as they
Either
have
that
their
or
food
they're
and their
just,
entertainment.
yeah, they're I don't know, because it is going to have an impact. If you look at how much my country has changed in 20, 30 years. Well, let's say, 30 years from now, a lot of people that are now completely oblivious, they're going to retire. And the country that they're going to retire in is going to look a lot different than the country they were working in. And, you can kind of extrapolate where it's going, and it's probably not going to be that great. Um, but so it is going to have an impact on you. But yeah, anyway, and even within one life, there are lessons to be learned. But yeah, I don't know.
No,
What can you do?
you're right about that too. My country has changed so much that I don't even recognize it anymore. Like it's changed so much from when I was a kid. And the 80s and 90s, we kind of thought America was invincible. We couldn't imagine it collapsing. But now it's like, it's not really even America anymore. It's something else that's here. And yeah, it's kind of like my wife, she's not from here. She's been here about 9 years and she's been shocked just how much since things have changed since she came here. So, yeah, I mean, and if you're going to compare it with like what happened in the Middle Ages, to elicit the Middle Ages, like the Germanic invasions and all that. Well, and this may be controversial, but Europe was still mostly European, since there wasn't really like a demographic change to the same degree as what we're seeing now. So Europe was mostly European, all the way from Roman times all the way up into the 20th century. So you could argue that how much it set things back when the Western Roman Empire got collapsed, and then there was chaos for a while. What is going to be the outcome of this? It's going to be different outcome, but it will be a collapse of some sort.
Yeah,
So
for
so
sure.
it's like in some ways it's not exactly repeating, I guess, history, but it is rhyming. You can say that.
Well, you can't predict what's going to. You can also cannot freeze time. Like things will happen. Like even if you kept everything the same, there would be some kind of outside pressure that will force change somehow, whether it's a virus outbreak or whatever. But in this case, it seems like it is purposely driven in a certain direction. And
Yes.
yeah, anyway, I wonder what's to be gained. But
Nothing for us is to be gained. That's
that's
for
for sure. Yeah,
But
that's for sure.
somebody's going to benefit from it, at least in the
Yeah,
short term.
in that regard, I would think I would prefer to live somewhere during the, you know, middle times of the medieval. By the way, a time that was pretty warm, so there was and for a lot of places, like, yeah, there wasn't a lot of social mobility and things like that. But I would also argue that the whole social mobility part is quite new, and I'm talking like more like the past maybe 50, 60, 100 years. The social mobility part is at least here in Europe. In US, probably it's been there for longer, but here in Europe, that really wasn't the norm either. Like, most people grew up in a class and died in a class that they grew up in, so that they were born in. So anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, and also you could say that feudalism is coming back because, you know, property taxes are technically, it's kind of a form of soft feudalism, or rather it's the camel's nose coming into the tent. Because if I buy something, then why do I have to keep paying for it? So if I buy this house, finish paying off my house, that should be the end. If it's really mine, that should be the end of all the payments. But I have to keep paying the state or the government in order to keep something that I already paid for. Then really, you know, that's kind of a form of like being a tenant. It's like I'm living on somebody else's land for the rest of my life and
Yeah.
paying. You know, I'm working. I'm not working directly for the government or a lord or anything like that, but I'm still paying them. So, and then you have this other thing that starts with a G and ends with a R that's going on, where they're straight up saying, you know, we don't want you to own any resources by 2030. So
Yeah.
there we go. They're trying to re-implement a type of feudalism, but
Yeah,
it just,
there's some ruins nearby where the local lord would even he would even tax the wind. And and I was like, that's crazy. But the more I think about it, like, we're not that far from that. Like, I
well,
think
now they
even
want, yeah,
some
now they,
governments are taxing your local wind energy, or your solar energy that you produce locally. They'll still tax you for it, because why not?
they want to put a
Yeah,
carbon tax on everybody now. So,
yeah,
like carbon. So what I breathe out, in other words. So there you go. You know, some
yeah.
horrible ideas are returning. You know, and
And talking about witch hunts, we've had some crazy witch hunts, and I think we believe we live in very rational times, and
I
I
don't.
think what we've experienced in the past few years, recently, I think a lot of people have noticed that society is far less rational, including a lot of the scientists, or maybe even especially a lot of the scientists.
I think the
Um,
scientists have no morals for the most part. I think they do what they need to do to get their paycheck.
well, and I think science at one point becomes a religion, and then you have a new form of Catholicism, and
Yeah.
it's the kind without God that Dostoevsky talked about, because we don't need God anymore. Now science is God, or the church is God, or the government is God in this case. Um, I think those are seems to be the direction we're heading in, and we call that modern. Or but really, it's something that also could have existed back in the old Roman days. It's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
Anyway, quite depressing. Maybe we should close this topic off.
Yeah.
All right.
Dropped enough
So the
black
medieval
pearls.
times, they were dark, but there were good reasons for all the challenges, such as the plague, invasions, um, yeah, and it's not like people were somehow backwards compared to other times. They just had a really rough, decentralized, feudalistic society.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. I definitely would not say they were backwards, and I don't want anybody to walk away with that perspective after listening to this. I think people today are actually more. I think the average person today is a lot more backwards than the average person, at any stage of the medieval period.
I think if you drop a modern average person of today in the woods together with some random average person from medieval times, I think the medieval person is gonna do a lot better.
Yeah, that person's gonna end up being the leader for sure,
Yeah,
even
yeah,
if it's a woman.
yeah.
And
They'd,
yeah,
they'd still be twice the men as yeah, but for sure. Yeah.
yeah, women, medieval women were way tougher than today's women.
Yeah,
Like,
and they had a lot of skills and things too,
so yeah,
yeah,
because
and
they're
within
running their
Germanic
house.
culture, they often had way more rights than women did in any other part of the world as well. But that's also a different topic. So
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
people were much more ferocious back then. But
you had to be
yeah,
like
you had
today.
to be.
But also, people died of all sorts of like a rotten tooth, and then today people are dying of
Well,
cancer. Like,
that's another thing that people in the Dark Ages or medieval times that they all had shitty teeth. It's actually not true
really?
because the average person barely ate any sugar.
Hmm.
There was only the royals that were eating like all the sugary foods and things like that. They would have bad teeth, but the average person, like a farmer or whatever, they would just eat whole food, and as such, they wouldn't have any teeth decay or anything like that because of their diet. So
Okay. Well, I know,
yeah,
like in the 1800s, people were dying of that like rotten tooth, and I guess yeah, sugar. Okay.
yeah. But I mean, yeah, before there was such penicillin was around, people would die of the small, tiniest things. That was even in the 1900s. That was
Cut
still
on
the
the
case.
leg or something.
Yeah.
You hear about Lou Lee, the composer that made our old theme song that we used to have? Like, I heard that he dropped like during the Rococo period, the director would have like an actual staff, like Gandalf or something. They'd be directing with that, and Lou Lee dropped the staff on his foot, and he got like toe infection as a result. And the doctors were like, "We got to cut off your foot," and he's like, "No, I refuse." And then it progressed. They said, "We got to cut off your leg," and he refused that, and then he just died of the infection. That's what I heard. I don't know if you can take that with a grain of salt, but yeah, I think I've rambled for enough. So we'll go ahead and
Trying to
close it
think, I'm
off.
pretty sure I have somebody in my family that died, or like close to the family that died from a boil,
Oh my goodness.
which is got infect. It's basically infected by it's a bacteria, which is pretty usual nowadays. But yeah, it's basically a pus-filled boil, and because it was before there was penicillin around, they died. So yeah.
That's tough, man. Yeah. Yeah, I probably would have been dead by now if I was alive in the 1800s or the medieval period. If I was alive in the medieval period, I'd try to get a job working for like the king doing the artwork or something. And that,
My ancestors are all like land workers, so they weren't even farmers. Like they didn't even own their own farms. So, but anyway, so I don't
yeah,
know.
probably mine too. I had I mean, that's like most of our ancestors, right? They just worked the land
Yeah,
for someone else.
yeah.
Yeah, and then maybe served in the army or, for a while as like a man at arms or something. Yeah.
So I guess it's not that bad. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. It's still better than working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. So
I think honestly, with what's coming towards us, I think that the medieval period is going to look like a blessed golden age. Like
yeah.
actually, the medieval
It was a
period
golden age for the Vikings. That's why they spread out all over the place
because they
because
took the
there
gold.
were well, there were too many of them. They had their population was exploding because it was a warm period, And normally it's the frigid north. It got a little bit warmer, so their crop production went way up, and so they had more children, and then there wasn't enough place, so they started, going other places. But yeah, hunting for gold. So
hunting for gold and land.
Yeah, and women.
And women.
All right, man. Well, hey, appreciate the topic, and so hope everybody's learned Dark Age, not so dark.
No, the Dark Age is dark. The Middle Ages is a longer period. Dark Age is just the period at the beginning.
Yeah, it's just a period in the middle.
Dark Age, the Middle Ages, the Dark Age elicited the Middle Ages. Like I said, not to conflate the Dark Age with the Middle Ages, right? Because Dark Age is when your civilization experiences a collapse of some kind. The entire Middle Ages is not the collapse. Even like the most cynical view of the Middle Age is that it's a time of recovering from a collapse. So
there you have it.
There we have it. Yep.
All right, man.
Factus est natura mirante, mundus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine, gaudete.